The blizzard hit the mountain valley like a silent war, no warning, no howling winds to signal its coming, just snow, falling fast and thick like some great hand had torn open a sack of flour across the sky. By the time most settlers even bothered to glance at the horizon, their fences were already vanishing under the drift. But by then, Miriam Coulter had already sealed the last hatch. She didn't live like the other ranchers. She didn't build like them either. And in that brutal January of 1871, when the worst blizzard anyone alive could remember came crawling over the Bitterroot Mountains like a living thing, her odd little stable, buried 3 feet under earth, became the only reason her horses survived. They'd laughed, of course. They always laughed at her. That wasn't new. "Who buries a stable?" they'd sneered when she first carved the hollow behind her cabin, built it of stone and sod, then shoveled earth back over it like a grave. They'd stood in groups, pipe smoke curling from bearded mouths, shoulders shaking with smug amusement, calling it the widow's mole hole, the widow's tomb. Some called it the horse coffin. "Go ahead," she'd said once quietly, not looking up from her work. "Laugh while the sun shines." Most had taken that for some sad attempt at poetry, but Miriam hadn't been speaking in verse. She was thinking of the winds, the way they howled down the Bitterroots without mercy every winter, clawing at plankwood stables like wolves at a trapper's skin. She remembered the sound of her husband's horses screaming the winter before, when they all froze standing, tails fused to the walls of the barn, eyes iced open. That year the wind had taken them all in one night. The year after, the ground would not. That was when she began to dig. Miriam Coulter was not a big woman. She was nearing 40, with skin darkened from sun and scar, hands calloused like leatherwork, and a quiet look in her eye that made men avoid holding her gaze too long. She had no family left, and she asked help from no one. She sold eggs, trapped varmints, and every week she rode one of her 2 remaining horses, Greystone or Finch, into town with just enough butter or jerky to buy a few supplies. She didn't stay long, and nobody offered her company. They just watched from behind their front windows as she passed, bundle on her back, rifle slung like a child behind her shoulder. "She's trying to freeze to death slower than her man did," someone muttered once. But no one said that to her face, because when Miriam built that buried stable, she didn't build it like a grieving widow. She built it like a survivor preparing for war. She started that summer and she built it with her bare hands. There were no neighbors helping, no crews, no town boys eager for coins. Just Miriam, her shovel, and an old draft horse named Greystone dragging timbers uphill while flies buzzed around her sweat. She dug the stable low, into the slope behind her cabin where the earth curved like the back of a spoon. The soil there was dense, clay-heavy, and took weeks to break apart. But she worked day by day, one sunburnt armful at a time, cutting deep until she'd hollowed a long rectangular pit wide enough for 4 horses. Then she built the walls up with thick pine beams and braced the ceiling with salvaged rafters from her husband's old wagon barn. Above that she laid sod, layer after layer, then shoveled the dirt back in. She carved 2 narrow ventilation shafts through old stovepipes and sealed them with wire mesh. The result was nothing like a stable anyone had ever seen. It was more like a cellar, a long, warm, earthen box hidden beneath the earth, low, windproof, sun-cooled in summer, heat-trapping in winter. The only visible part above ground was a small wood-framed doorway built into the hillside, half buried under a brush canopy. It didn't even look like a door unless you knew where to squint, and once the doorway was sealed, with a heavy quilt over the frame and a plank bolted across, no snow could enter. When fall came, she loaded it with straw, salt blocks, smoked hay, and feed bags sewn shut with twine. She moved in 2 horses, her aging Greystone and Finch, a mare barely out of foal. Then she waited. The others weren't so cautious. Most of the ranchers down valley spent the fall finishing cabins, fencing corrals, sharpening blades. They did not prepare for a storm beyond the usual. Their stables were plank-walled, single-layered, drafty but easy to clean. Their roofs were tin or shingle, and they creaked like ships when the wind hit. They were good enough until they weren't. And that year, when the sky cracked open and dumped snow thicker than flour and finer than dust, none of them stood a chance. The first day of the blizzard came without fanfare. It was bitter cold, but bright. Miriam was chopping kindling when she saw it, just a dark line on the far ridge, unmoving. It wasn't snow yet, not wind. Just a line, a strange dark horizon where none should be. She watched it while her breath steamed the air, watched it not move. That was the first warning. By sundown, it was gone, and by morning, it was everywhere. The snow came sideways that night, cold so sudden it cracked glass. Miriam had already sealed the stable door, stuffed the ventilation pipes with straw, and led Finch and Greystone inside under lantern light. The wind clawed at her scarf like hands, and she had to use a pry bar to wedge the hatch shut against the sucking pull of the gale. Then she sealed her own cabin, braced the windows, and lit every candle she had. She didn't sleep, no one did. By the third day, snow had climbed 6 feet high across most cabins. By the fifth, some ranchers were using ladders to escape from upstairs windows just to clear chimneys. Others had roofs sagging from weight. Fires were going out, and the livestock were dying fast. It wasn't just the cold, it was the air itself. Wind was so thin, even stables with small cracks became wind tunnels, and the horses, skittish, panicked, kicked themselves bloody trying to escape. At least 5 ranchers lost their entire stables in one night when the roof beams collapsed from snow weight. And on the 7th day, silence fell. Not calm, not peace. The kind of silence that only follows after too much death. And that's when the rumors started. They say the widow's horses are still alive. It was a whisper at first, shared over whiskey in the saloon, passed between men whose faces were lined with frostburn and grief. No way, ain't possible, not unless she kept 'em in the cabin with her. They say she buried her stable. Horses underground. Underground? Like a cave? That'd suffocate 'em. They say it didn't. On the 9th day, the snow began to melt in places, just enough to let men crawl from their lofts or dig their doors open. And from the ridgeline above the valley, where Miriam's cabin stood like a wart on the hill, smoke still rose in a thin, steady line. Not frantic, not dying, steady, and Greystone's bray echoed down the white hills like a ghost. By the time a group of half-frozen ranchers trudged up to her place to see for themselves, they found something that made no sense. Miriam's stable entrance was entirely covered. She'd stacked snow like bricks to block the entry hatch, sealed it with frozen mud, and built a small chimney from stovepipe that puffed faintly in the wind. An exhaust flew from the warm, horse-breathed interior below. She didn't answer their calls, so they stood, half shivering, staring at the small pipe like it was some kind of witch's charm. Below their feet, under 3 feet of packed earth and snow, were 2 living horses, warm, safe, breathing, while over 100 others in the valley had frozen to death standing. And Miriam never said a word. She just watched them from her window and let them wonder how she'd known. They didn't knock on her door, not the first time. They just stood out there in the snow, a cluster of half-starved, frostbit men, shifting awkwardly with their hats in their hands and boots buried to the shins in drift. None of them had spoken to Miriam Coulter since her husband died. Most hadn't even looked her in the eye in years. She didn't make it easy. But now, 10 days into a storm that had taken down entire roofs and left grown men sobbing in their empty barns, they found themselves unable to leave her hill, just standing there, staring at a chimney pipe that smoked when theirs had all gone cold. The blizzard had eased for the moment, wind trailing off into something like silence. The snow had a crust now, thick enough to walk across if you stepped light. Miriam's tracks were the only ones on the slope. She'd come out earlier with a pail of water and a hatchet, checked the chimney pipe above the buried stable, and disappeared again. They'd watched her from below like schoolboys watching a ghost, and when she didn't acknowledge them, didn't wave, didn't speak, they simply turned and trudged back down the ridge, eyes down, not sure what to make of it. But word spread fast. By evening, the saloon was full again. Her horses are alive. I saw her dump feed into a trough right down the ventilation shaft. Pipes warm to the touch. No way. Ain't natural. Boys, I buried 2 oxen last week. Dug a tunnel through the kitchen just to check the barn. Everything inside was stiff as timber. But the widow's got living horses under her goddamn house, like some mountain-dwelling pharaoh. Hell with that. I say we ask her how she built it. You ask her. Nobody did. Even then, after all the mocking and gossip, no one had the guts to go up to her door and ask how she did it. Because deep down, some of them didn't want to know. Knowing would mean admitting they'd failed, every single one of them. And she, the quiet widow who never smiled, had outsmarted them all. But it wasn't just cunning that built that buried stable. It was pain. And they didn't know half of it. 2 years before the blizzard, Miriam's husband, Jedediah Coulter, had died screaming in a fire that ate through their horse barn in the middle of the night. The wind that year had come down from the mountain like a living curse, shattering the stable door, turning the hayloft into a furnace. Jed had gone in to free the horses. He didn't come back out. 3 of the horses had fused to the walls where their skin melted before freezing again. Another was found half dead in the creek, blinded by steam, legs broken from the fall. The town had buried Jed in silence. Miriam didn't weep, didn't speak at the service. She just stood there as the priest read the rites, one hand on her rifle, the other gripping the leather reins of the last horse that hadn't died, Greystone, who limped for months after that. And when spring came, she started digging. People didn't understand her silence. They mistook it for grief or madness, or maybe some mixture of both. They didn't see it for what it really was. Clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes after you've lost everything, the kind that sharpens the edges of your soul like whetstone on steel. While others built their stables up, she went down. While they braced their roofs, she reinforced her floor. While they swept their porches, she cleared soil by the handful, every sunrise spent covered in sweat. Her fingers blistered raw from lifting logs and dragging stones. She knew what was coming, because she'd already lived through a worse storm, the one no one else had noticed. After the rumors spread that her horses had survived, a few men sent their wives to ask her quietly if they might purchase some of her hay or oats. Miriam didn't answer the door. One woman left a note. It was never picked up. Another left coins in a jar. They sat there until the thaw. No one dared knock. But come the end of January, when the second wave of the blizzard swept in, fiercer, darker, and somehow colder than the first, the town stopped caring whether she answered or not, because now it wasn't about pride, it was about survival. This time, it didn't start with snow. It started with cold, the kind of cold that made nails pop out of timber, that made wet ropes crack in half, that made breath freeze to your lips the moment you stepped outside. Children cried in their sleep, chickens froze to the roost, doors warped from the ice and had to be broken down just to get out. And Miriam's smoke still rose, every morning, without fail. On the 5th day of the second storm, one of the ranchers, Elijah Hardin, a man twice her size and half her patience, dragged himself up the hill with his coat tied around his head and a rope pulling a sled behind him. On the sled was a sack of barley, a broken harness, and his last remaining mule, too weak to stand. He stood outside her cabin, snow waist-high, shaking from fever, and called out once. "Miriam!" The wind answered. He called again. "Please, I'll trade, I'll work. I got a little girl back home. Mule can't make another day. I ain't asking for a handout. He trailed off. And then, silence. No one saw what happened next. But the next day, Hardin's mule was seen tied behind a different man's cabin down valley, alive, and Miriam's smoke still rose. After that, nobody questioned the buried stable. Not anymore. They started calling it the Hold, not in mockery now, in awe, a place where the storm hadn't reached, where horses still breathed, where warmth still existed. Then came the thaw. It didn't arrive gently. It burst. The ice melted like wax under flame, releasing everything it had buried. Dead cattle began to surface, stiff-legged and bloated. Fences snapped apart under the weight of runoff. Streams rose into creeks, creeks into rivers, and rivers into floodwaters. But Miriam's land was on the slope. Her trench drains had held. Her stable had not flooded. And when she finally opened the hatch, smoke puffed out in a quiet sigh. Inside, Finch nuzzled her hand. Greystone snorted like he'd never seen the sun. And when the horses stepped out of the earth like Lazarus from the tomb, the whole valley went quiet, even the wind. It was Elias Tomlin who finally broke the silence. Days later, in a town meeting half-filled with frostbit survivors, and men still bruised from digging livestock graves. "I say we ask her," he said simply. "Ask her what?" came the murmur. "How she built it? And why?" That last one lingered. Why? They didn't know the half of it. They didn't know that Miriam had buried more than a stable. She'd buried memories, buried screams, buried fire. The stable wasn't just warmth or shelter, it was defiance. It was her refusal to let the world take from her again what it already had. Her refusal to stand in a snow-choked field and scream into the night for something that would never come back. So she built down. And when the blizzard came, she didn't run. She descended, and she waited. When they finally came, this time not with hands empty or heads low, but with questions, they found her behind the cabin, chopping logs with slow, practiced motions. She didn't stop when they approached. She didn't greet them either. Tomlin cleared his throat. "Miriam, ma'am, we came to ask about the hold." Still she chopped. "Storm near killed us all," he said, softer now. "But you made it through. And not just you. Your animals, too. You saved them. We'd like to understand how." Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were tired but unshaken. "You want the blueprints?" she asked flatly. "No, ma'am, just the principles." She nodded once, slow. "Heat rises, wind kills, earth doesn't move." There was a silence, a pause as the men looked at one another, unsure if that was all. It was. She turned back to her axe, and they walked away, their breath rising in the morning air. By spring, 4 families began carving pits behind their cabins. By summer, 2 more had sod-roofed root cellars refitted for livestock. And by the next winter, the widow's crazy idea had a new name across the region. The Coulter Hold, not the tomb, not the mole hole, the hold. And when one rancher from across the ridge rode over with a letter from his brother in Montana asking about buried stables like the one the widow built, Miriam just laughed once, low and quiet, and didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The wind had already spoken for her. The valley changed after that winter. Not all at once. Not in the way men tend to think of change. Flags lowered, streets renamed, grand speeches made with a rifle in hand, but slow, like ice melting at the corners of a river, almost unseen. They didn't speak of it directly, but everyone began watching the horizon more often. Everyone began building closer to the land, not up toward the sky, but down into the soil, digging with hands rougher than before. No one laughed at Miriam anymore, but they didn't praise her either. They left her be, which, perhaps, was the greatest praise they knew how to offer. And Miriam, for her part, didn't seek thanks. She never walked into town with her shoulders straighter or eyes brighter. She never claimed any credit, never taught any class, never charged $1 for advice. She just continued doing what she'd always done, feeding her horses, checking her roof, boiling her water in the mornings before the wind rose. But some noticed. One of them was a boy. His name was Seth Turner. He couldn't have been older than 12 that spring. But already he moved like a man who knew what hunger was. The blizzard had taken both his uncles, left his mother frostbitten near the knuckles and unable to wield a knife without trembling. The Turners hadn't had horses to begin with. They had 2 goats and a pig, all dead by the 3rd week of the storm. When the thaw came, Seth's mother was seen crawling out of their attic with her hands wrapped in bloodied rags. The next day, Seth climbed Miriam's hill alone. She saw him from the window, small frame, loose coat, knapsack made of old flour sacks stitched with twine. He moved cautiously, the way deer do when they smell something that doesn't belong in the clearing. He kept stopping to check the slope behind him, as if afraid someone would call him back down, but no one did. Miriam met him at the side of the house, a kettle already steaming over the fire pit, an axe in one hand. "You're Turner's boy," she said. He nodded. "What do you want?" He looked at his boots, then back up. "To learn how." She waited. "How to build what you built," he added. "Down there." He gestured, one hand vague, but she knew what he meant. The hold. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no either. She just handed him a second cup, motioned for him to sit. He did. They drank in silence. Later, when he stood to leave, she handed him a scrap of paper torn from the inside of a flour sack. On it were 3 lines, written in block letters. 8 feet down, sod above wood, don't trust the roof, that was all. But it was enough. By the end of that summer, the boy had started digging. By fall, he'd hollowed a trench under the lean-to behind his cabin, just wide enough for 1 goat. By winter the goat was alive, and so was his mother. No one called him foolish, no one said a word. But the next spring, 3 other boys came to Miriam's door. One was a rancher's son, one was an orphan who worked odd jobs sweeping the store, and the third was a Lakota child, quiet and older than he looked, who said nothing, just waited with arms folded. Miriam gave them water, and then she showed them the stone pit she'd started behind her tool shed. No words, just stone, earth, and shadow. They followed her lead. She never planned to teach, but word of the hold traveled faster than she could keep quiet. Soon letters started coming, not just from nearby settlements, but from the far ridges and even from the fort itself. Ranchers, soldiers, settlers, asking what they all called the widow's method. She never answered them. But some of the boys did. By the time the second winter rolled around, there were 8 buried shelters in the valley, 4 of them big enough for livestock, 2 small enough to hold only firewood and salt meat. One was built into a ravine wall, another beneath a disused root cellar, and Miriam, as always, kept her own hold quiet, clean, and invisible. But that winter came harder than expected, worse even than the year before, not because it was colder, it wasn't, but because it came early, before the earth had hardened, before the harvest was done, before firewood piles were stacked high. It